In the late 1970s, a band emerged who, thanks to their thrillingly unique sound and intensely charismatic lead singer, sounded quite unlike anything that had gone before. Joy Division were a Manchester-based four-piece, a quartet of young men whose profound influence on modern music resonates hugely to this day.
It's about suicide, and it's about darkness, and it's about death, it's about emotions, it's about losing control but trying to keep control.
They're actually stunning performances. I mean, when you actually see Ian Curtis moving, the way he dances just was mesmerising.
It was such a shock, such an electrifying experience to see this guy who just wasn't like any rock star you'd seen before. He wasn't posing, he wasn't doing what he thought a frontman should do.
This programme is a review of Joy Division's brief yet startling career, the music they made and the creative minds that made it. In the summer of 1976, the first rumblings of a new musical movement were making themselves known. Britain was about to be exposed to punk, most notably via the shock tactics of controversial young upstarts, the Sex Pistols.
You made you look so bloody boring.
Punk would have been quite astonishing. If you compare it with what else was around at the time, Queen or Pink Floyd or The Who playing huge stadium gigs, to see a band like that who were kind of so original and kind of raw and energetic, and it must have completely blown everybody's mind.
Really up to that point, you know, rock had become quite sort of slick and professional, and here was this punk aesthetic kind of absolutely encapsulated by the Pistols and by their whole kind of iconoclastic attitude. It really spoke to this particular group of disaffected fans and kind of wannabe anti-stars, really.
It was the Sex Pistols' gigs at the Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall, attended by all the formative members of Joy Division, that really began to ignite creative sparks.
The Pistols were going around the country inspiring people, so when they came to Manchester, I think it was the most impact they'd had in any city, and Manchester became the second city of punk.
The twin gigs at the Leicester Free Trade Hall famously had quite a profound influence on the people who would become Joy Division. The very next day of the second gig, Pete Hutt went out and bought a bass guitar and basically started to learn from that point onwards. But having said that, it wasn't a particularly great gig. There have been books about it, there have been films about it, and it was a fairly mundane gig, to be honest. People didn't pogo as they were portrayed in 24-Hour Party People.
Genius in the story.
While the gig has retained a mythical status, certain elements have been exaggerated over the years. Manchester celebrity Tony Wilson was present, but his then-wife Lindsay Reed, portrayed here by Shirley Henderson, was not.
I was at the Slaughtering the Dogs gig about two weeks earlier, which was similarly punkish, you know. There was a guy, well, Tony remembers he was wearing a dress, and it was definitely wild. Some of it just was horrible. I mean, I remember at the Electric Circus, Tony on stage having beer chucked all over him, and people were gobbing at him, and I was standing at the back thinking, oh, you poor thing, you know. And when he came off, I was going to console him, but he was elated. He thought it was fantastic. But I thought it was absolutely gross and disgusting.
The Sex Pistols show in Manchester clearly was hugely important for the music scene there. Pretty much everyone was there who then went on to form the kind of key Manchester punk and post-punk bands. So you have to say that it was the kind of crucible for the late 70s, early 80s scene in Manchester.
We just caught up in all the, you know, the punk side, you know, let's get playing and all this. After seeing the Pistols, but when we got together really, it was about the Anarchy tour and the And it took a hell of a long time for us to get everything sorted out. Yeah. And you could see all other groups sort of coming up all the time, you know, so.
The influence of this gig has been known to raise an interesting issue. Joy Division, believed by many to be the epitome of post-punk, actually came together during the height of the original punk phenomenon.
Now, the thing about punk is that it was liberating, but it then almost immediately became something that you had to escape from.
It's a very different kind of punk rock up north. I don't think people wanted to be just like the London scene, which was a certain kind of style, a certain kind of sound. People didn't wear those kind of clothes or play that kind of music up here.
Once you're into 78, punk, in its kind of pure raw form, is already sort of on the way out, and the bands are becoming more musical, if you like, and they're becoming more intellectual, perhaps more cerebral, and just that kind of dole cue, leather jacket, safety pin thing is over.
And I suppose first truly post-punk band are Suited and the Banshees, who were kind of inspired by the Sex Pistols to become musicians. And they did a very sort of similar thing to the Joy Division. If you're trying to sort of do something different and you're not trying to play rock music, you often end up with that kind of slightly monotonous, repetitive bass lines and backing tracks that Joy Division started out doing.
Whether Joy Division or Warsaw actually said we are a punk band is irrelevant, really. It's just taking the energy of punk and making something out of it.
An embryonic Joy Division started out in Manchester under the name of Warsaw, and in July 1977, they recorded their first demo tape.
They were kind of very raw to begin with. I think they were one of those bands that developed.
There was no indication at all, really, that something remarkable was going to happen. I don't think anyone could claim that.
What's distinctive about Joy Division isn't immediately apparent with what you hear, what you heard on stage with Warsaw.
Very, very early on, you can hear the roots of what's going to turn into Joy Division, but imagine if you saw them at the time, you'd probably think they were just another two-bit local band trying to play punk rock.
Warsaw's raw and explicitly punk stylings also carried through to the band's next incarnation. Now officially rechristened as Joy Division, the group consisted of singer Ian Curtis, bassist Peter Hook, guitarist Bernard Sumner, nicknamed Barney, and drummer Stephen Morris. It was in June 1978 that they would release their first EP, a 4-track collection entitled An Ideal for Living. Interestingly, the opening track shared the same name as their previous band title.
3-5-0-1-2-5, go! I was there in the backstage when this light came around.
Ideal for Living is... It's good, retrospectively. It's good but not great. Musically, they haven't quite kind of found their sort of space and their kind of rhythm. I mean, they're still bashing out the rhythm in a very conventional, quick-fire 4/4 sort of way.
If that's all they'd recorded, it probably would have just disappeared into the mist of history like 100 other kind of post-punk EPs.
After punk, there's a lot of questions. People are like, what are we going to do with the music? That's what people are thinking. Let's go somewhere else. And people are looking for different ways of making music. The whole thing about punk would be to destroy rock and roll, but obviously that's a complete myth, really. But maybe making rock and roll in different kind of ways, you know, not just the 12-bar.
At the time, they wouldn't really have sounded that special on the basis of that. It's only in hindsight that you can see that, especially if you look at the sort of lyrics where Curtis has kind of, you know, he did find his lyrical voice in lots of ways quite early on, and certain themes are already beginning to develop.
The sound is just not distinctive enough, and it's just too close to, you know, something like The Clash. The standard abrasive, chunky sounding punk music.
At this early stage, Joy Division's somewhat underwhelming output had been overshadowed by another issue, the controversy surrounding their name. A direct reference to the 1955 novel House of Dolls, Joy Division was a slang term referring to groups of women forced into prostitution by Nazi concentration camp officials.
Curtis, in particular, was fascinated by the Third Reich, not as a sort of closet Nazi, but just in terms of kind of what it represented.
He's fascinated by the Nazis, but it doesn't make him a Nazi just because he's fascinated at how utterly depraved and revolting human beings can get. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. The whole Nazi thing is very interesting, but only because it's the utter dark side of humanity.
You could say it's quite kind of a juvenile fascination in a way, but the imagery was so powerful that these lyrics, which are very, very sort of underrated, it kind of became a metaphor for the sort of feelings he had. He was trying to express, and it was only later that he became sort of deft enough to sort of escape that.
Joy Division, do you know what that is, Mr. Wilson?
It's when the Nazis picked out racially pure women and had sex with them.
Yeah, well, Joy Division, that's us, eh?
Well, it's a very Nazi name.
So?
Yeah, but it's quite cheery as well.
I think Ian and Barney did have an interest in Germany because they grew up with air raid shelters in the back garden and things like that. The Second World War was still around in a sense, and Ian loved history, so there was that interest.
I think people forget the people who grew up in the 50s and 60s that they were kind of force-fed war films. All these images of kind of Nazis in their uniforms, you know, and Spitfires and Hurricanes and Messerschmitts. Every schoolboy had that sort of fascination with the Nazis, and Joy Division weren't any different.
Hi, Hitler! Now let's see you walk.
It won't work, you know.
Yes, it'll work. Let's see you walk. Put some style into it. Put your hand on your hip. That's what the bloody Boche have, style. Slap your gloves against the leg. Lass mich in Ruhe.
It really was just a juvenile fascination, which they soon evolved from.
Although the band had no fascist leanings whatsoever, it could be said that they were nevertheless playing a dangerous game, one which had the possibility of them attracting a right-wing following.
I think a lot of right-wing people did attach themselves to the bands, but it wasn't like the gigs were like Nazi rallies or anything. But I've met people over the years who've been pretty like revolting people into the right-wing thing who have been fascinated by Joy Division, fairly misunderstood what they were singing about because the music is very, very dark. They have that kind of Eastern European look in their clothes. There's always like this little rumble of this Nazi thing that goes on and on and on behind them all the time, even though it's blatantly not true.
In a way, they escaped that, in a sense that Madness, a year or so later, didn't. You know, those factions attached themselves to them, and I don't think they ever did to Joy Division to any great extent at all.
With a name like Joy Division, you know, there is always the possibility that you are going to attract some sort of Nazi far-right following, and those people were certainly swilling around at the time. But there was nothing in the music that would have attracted them. I mean, the whole nature of the music was clearly much more kind of sombre and ruminative, and it just wasn't, it was too good for Nazis, you know.
Joy Division, however, were about to enter the next phase of their career. In September 1978, they made their first ever television appearance.
Seeing as how this is the programme which previously brought you first television appearances from everything from the Beatles to the Buzzcocks, would you like to keep our hand in and keep you informed of the most interesting new sounds in the Northwest? This Joy Division is the most interesting new sound we've come across in the last 6 months. They're a Manchester band with the exception of the guitarist, who comes from Salford. Very important difference. They're called Joy Division.
There was a lot of kind of weird stuff on telly at that time, more so than there is now. I mean, you know, there was the Earl Grey Whistle Test, and which had sort of fairly avant-garde stuff on it sometimes, and then you even had programmes like Revolver, the punk show was on, where you could tune in and see the Rich Kids and the Skids and all those kind of bands.
That early Granada Reports appearance was the work of Tony Wilson, who in those days was a presenter who was on every single night when you were having your tea, so everybody knew him and all the mothers loved him, and you know, kind of this cuddly presenter. And Ian Curtis famously sort of attacked him at rafters and asked him if he'd put him on.
You a friend of yours?
Yeah, he's our singer.
Oh, hey, Steve.
Hi, Tony Wilson. Nice to meet you. Is he going to hit me? You're quite close to me there.
Yeah, I know, but I want to be.
Why?
Because you're a cunt, mate.
I know, I heard you the first time.
To the center of the city in the night, waiting for you.
I think that one of the most arresting things that you see is when he does the kind of the epileptic butterfly dance, the trap butterfly dance. It was that dance, I think, that caught most people's eye.
Most British bands don't really do very much, do they? They just kind of stand there and stare at the floor. And of course, the punk bands have been great because they didn't. You know, there was like a really great aggression and great energy to bands. But here's something very, very different.